We are outgunned und outnumbered.
That's right. You are so very much. So, are you gonna surrender?
Nein.
World War I in Africa is fairly unknown because when we think of the Great War, we envision images like these. But images like these also belong to the historical narrative. Several bloody campaigns were fought in Africa during the First World War, and the longest and the bloodiest of them all was the East Africa Campaign that actually came to an end after the official end of the First World War. Stay tuned. Welcome to History Hustle, and I am so excited to announce you that this video is part of a larger collaboration series where several history YouTubers combine their forces to bring an interesting series about the history of the African continent for you. The previous video was made by Step Back History and it was about the brief history of South Africa. If you haven't checked that one out yet, go do it now. During the Berlin Conference 1884, the European powers came together to discuss how to carve up the African continent. Germany acquired several territories in Africa, and their biggest colony was German East Africa, which consisted of what is now the mainland of Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda. It was first run by a chartered company, the German East Africa Company, but after a local revolt, the German government took it over. Things for the local population were not improving, so soon another revolt occurred early 20th century, the Maji uprising. Here, Europeans were killed by local Africans, and the Germans had to build up a large force to suppress the uprising. Some 150,000 Africans, some sources even claim more, were killed in this uprising, and on the German side, only a handful of Europeans and several hundred askaris, auxiliary troops, were killed in action. And this brings us to the German colonial army. They were named the Schutztruppen, which means protection forces. Now, iconic was their slouch hat, type of hat that was also worn by Anzac forces and members of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. And what we see is the same thing we see in many European colonial forces, is that the officers were European and enlisted men were drafted locally. Enlisted men from East Africa were named askaris. The size of the force was small and was only enlarged when there was an uprising or a war. The German Governor General, his name was Heinrich Schnee, he demanded the colony to be neutral, and he basically fell back on the Congo Agreement that was signed in 1884, which stated that in case of a European war, the European colonies in Africa would remain neutral. However, the commander of the German army in East Africa, his name was Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, he had a different approach. Von Lettow-Vorbeck's plan was that he wanted to tie down as much as Allied forces as possible so that they could not be deployed on the European front. And this was against the wishes of Governor General Heinrich Schnee.
Mein Gott, es ist wahr, aber we are neutral, so we shall not engage in the conflict. Emil, I order you not to engage.
Alright,
understood.
In August and September 1914, von Lettow-Vorbeck went into the offense, where he ordered his troops to attack British East Africa in the north, and most raids were concentrated at the Uganda Railway. In November 1914, the Allies landed at the coastal place of Tanga. Now, the Allied force here consists mostly of inexperienced Indian troops and some Australians. They were mercilessly harassed by the terrain, which had numerous of hostile wild beasts. The Allies were not able to capture Tanga, and they retreated with some heavy losses, several hundred dead and 500 wounded. The Germans suffered 1/5 of the Allies' casualties and also captured large of war material that was left behind by the British.
Danke.
You bloody bastards. We'll be back. We'll be back.
Good luck.
At the same time, the Allies attacked a German stronghold at Kilimanjaro, but were defeated. In 1915, the Battle of Yasin took place. The Germans were, once again, victorious. However, von Lettow-Vorbeck realized he could not wage war forever like this, because for now, the Allied and German numbers were kinda even. But soon the Allies would build up their numbers, and then the Germans would be drained of manpower and resources fast. So therefore, von Lettow-Vorbeck switched to guerrilla warfare, and he continued raids directed at the Uganda Railway. Over the course of 1915, it was mostly quiet at the East African front. See, the Portuguese, they were still neutral. The Belgians had great difficulties with building up their force since their home country was overrun by Germany, at least most of it, and the Allies, they were also building up their forces for a big push in 1916. They sent the South African Expeditionary Force led by Jan Smuts that would attack from British East Africa from the northeast, with an additional force that would attack from the northwest at Lake Victoria. The Belgians, they would advance through the west, and another British force would attack from Rhodesia from the southwest. And when Portugal declared war on Germany March 1916, the Portuguese would advance from the south, from their colony of Mozambique. Things were looking grim for Germany. In May 1916, it was time for the Allies' big push. Around 300,000 men tried to encircle the troops of von Lettow-Vorbeck. Now, von Lettow-Vorbeck, he avoided capture and he retreated to the south, therefore giving up half of the colony. The Belgians, they advanced from the west and they conquered Rwanda and Burundi, and in September they captured Tabora. The Germans were driven further south, and at some point they just held on to 1/3 of their colony. Meanwhile, the Allies captured the German East Africa's coastal places. The Portuguese, they made their move in October, but they were driven back. Also, the Allies were in bad shape by now. See, because of their pursuing campaigns, many of the Allied soldiers died from disease and exhaustion. Also, their supply lines became overstretched. Now, the Germans actually suffered much less from disease than the Allies did. And why is that? Well, a reason for this was given by Robert Gaudy, who wrote the book African Kaiser. Part of this German resistance to disease must be attributed to the simple matter of uniforms. In the field, the Germans wore high-collar tunics, long-sleeved shirts, long pants, and puttees or high boots, thus exposing less of their skin to noxious insect bites than the British, who dressed for comfort in shorts and open-neck short-sleeved shirts. Over the course of 1917, the British replaced their white troops by black troops, who are more suitable to the terrain. The Germans kept holding on south of the colony and emerged victorious at yet another battle, the Battle of Mahiwa, where they defeated the British. However, this victory was a severe strain on the German forces, and therefore von Lettow-Vorbeck decided to do the impossible. He left German East Africa with his troops and marched into Portuguese Mozambique. There, they lived off the land by raiding and plundering, causing unspeakable harm for the local population. Von Lettow-Vorbeck's troops kept harassing the Allied forces, who would not be able to capture him. In September 1918, they crossed back into German East Africa and even crossed into British Rhodesia. The Allies were just not able to capture the Lion of the Desert. But it eventually did came to an end.
General, ich habe eine Message from the motherland. The war is over. Es ist vorbei.
Soldat, danke. Von Lettow-Vorbeck later wrote about this moment the following. This was news enough if it were confirmed and showed the desperate situation of the fatherland. Nothing else could account for the surrender of a force still maintaining itself proudly and victoriously in the field. Without being in a position to examine, I had to tell myself that the conditions imposed upon us were inevitable and must be loyally carried out. On the 25th of November 1918, von Lettow-Vorbeck finally surrendered to the Allies. Over the course of 4.5 years, they had marched 6,500 kilometers to the African wilderness, tying down hundreds and thousands of Allied troops. Yet to note here that von Lettow-Vorbeck's strategy to keep these troops away from the Western Front wasn't really that successful, since from 1917 onwards most Allied troops were drafted locally. The fighting itself wasn't as large scale as at the Western Front, and most victims, and this is actually the saddest part of the whole history of the East Africa campaign, were civilians who died because of famine that was caused by von Lettow-Vorbeck's harsh policies of living off the land. Hundreds and thousands of Africans, some estimations say even over 1 million, died because of this. They died because of a war that was caused by Europeans. 2 disclaimers. 1. The rifles I use in this video are deactivated according to Dutch law and cannot fire a single bullet and are legal to possess in the Netherlands. 2. I hope you enjoyed the reenactment scenes, but do note here, by me dressing myself up as a German colonial soldier, I in no way approve of the colonization policies from the past. A special thanks to my patrons, and especially to Henry Clarkson and the President. I mentioned that the Belgians, they captured Rwanda and Burundi. And if you want to know more about these 2 small African nations, you make sure you check out the next video in this series, which is created by Mr. Beat, Rwanda and Burundi compared. Do not forget to subscribe and also check out the other videos in this amazing playlist created by awesome history YouTubers. See you next time!